All right. Well, today we're in the second part of a series called Greater Than One. Greater Than One. If you're new here, what we do is we take our messages, group them together in a series with some kind of common theme. And today's the second part of a series. And really where we're going with this, or where we started last week, is think about this, all right? What comes to mind when you hear the word church? Right? You've got something. There's some feelings, there might be a picture, there might be some complex emotions, you know. Maybe if you have to explain church to somebody who doesn't understand, you're like, oh, it's some place I go, it's between me and God. Maybe you do it out of obligation, but everybody's kind of got their own thing. And really the point of this series, what I said is last week, is that we're trying to kind of challenge what comes to mind when you think about church, maybe even expand what comes to mind when you think about church. And whether you've been in church for decades or this is your first time ever, maybe in decades, being in church, I think it's good for us to kind of step back and talk about what we think of, what we mean when we talk about church. So last week, we talked about this idea of church being greater than one person, right? We talked about how there is this need really in our culture, if you've been reading about it, and not just since the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, there's this issue called crowded loneliness, meaning there's people everywhere, but a lot of us are lacking meaningful connection and feeling lonely, and it's detrimental to us on so many different levels. And then we talked about the church, where a lot of people feel like, oh, church is just a thing where it's like between, me and God, and it's where I get my own little, spiritual cup filled, right? And that's good, but what if it's greater than that? In fact, we said, what if the connection, the community, the relationships, the authenticity that the church is supposed to offer solves the issue of loneliness in our culture? But that only happens if we're willing to be real, and not pretend, not wear a mask, not pretend like, we say certain things and act certain ways because we're in a certain place, but we come with all our broken pieces, hang-ups, doubts, issues, imperfections, and accept one another as we are, where we are. So this idea of church being greater than one person, because we were made for meaningful connection. Made for meaningful connection. So today, here's my question. All right? My question. How do you measure the impact of a life? Ever thought about that? Like, stop for a minute and think about the people in your life that you would say really made an impact on you for better, right? People that shaped you, the people that helped you become the person you are. Like for me, obviously, my parents, if you know my parents were a big part of that. They sacrificed for me. They gave so much for me. Like my parents are a huge part of the reason why I am the way I am. My in-laws, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, they've been this constant source of support and guidance. My wife, Allie, if you know her, she's put up with me now for like 10 years. She's helped to shape me. I've had coaches, teachers. Who is it for you? It's made an impact on your life. And if they did, how do you measure that? What was it that they did? Here's what I would suggest to you. I would suggest, and feel free to disagree with me, the impact of a life is measured by what is given, not by what is gained. I mean, think about that. Think about the people in your life. Maybe you've had teachers, right? And what have they done for you? They've served you. They've lived with open hands. They've given you wisdom. Maybe they've given you an example to follow. If it's parents or if it's family members, they've sacrificed for you. They've poured themselves out for you. There are people in your life that have helped to shape you, but that impact came in the form of some gift. Something that they gave of themselves, not in what like they gained for themselves. And you know what's interesting? What's interesting is that this is also true. When I say it's measured, I mean like universally. This is how we measure impact. If you've ever been to a funeral, the things that are shared about the person who's passed is always the things that they gave. At the end of someone's life, I've had the opportunity to spend time with people who are in their final hours, their final days. What you hear is like people, they look back on their lives with pride. They value what they've given, not what they've gained. There's no one who's sitting there on their deathbed that wants to see their stock portfolio. You know, no one wants to see, hey, show me my company's org chart. How high am I? Oh, that. But it's amazing. It's amazing. We tend to work for the gains, but we really end up valuing what we've given. We just did a whole series called Influencers. We were talking about people who changed the world. Every single one of them, their influence was found in what they gave to society, what they contributed, not what they consumed. And you too will measure your life in this way. The impact of your life will be measured by what you've given, not by what you've gained. And I'm not just talking about like financial resources. I'm talking about like whether or not you lived with open hands or with a closed fist. One person says the assumption that it's all for my consumption. What's amazing to me, or what I find really interesting, is when like as a culture, we agree on certain principles, or maybe even like research has shown certain principles to be true. What I like to do is then go back and see what Jesus had to say about that same topic. And he has been saying this. He said this like thousands of years ago and hit the nail on the head. Like pinned it down thousands of years ago. He was with a group of people. We call them his disciples. These were his closest friends, his closest followers. And then there were crowds that followed him everywhere because he was doing some awesome stuff. And so people just wanted to see, like, what's this guy about? So he's being followed around everywhere. And then he kind of like gives this message, not just to his disciples, but to like everyone, right? And I sometimes wonder how this was received. He says this, Mark records it like this. It says, then he called the crowd to him, like invited them a little closer along with his disciples, those 12 guys that were super tight with him. And he said this, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, fun, and take up their cross and follow me. Now, what's important whenever you're reading something like this, you have to first understand, okay, before I try and interpret this for myself, I have to understand what the original audience would have been hearing. And for us, this might be a little different than from what the original audience was hearing. Back then, disciples were part of culture. There were disciples everywhere. There were rabbis and disciples. Rabbi means teacher, disciple basically means student. And in that culture, disciples just followed around their rabbis, and if the rabbi was successful, by the end of his time with his disciples, which would have been years, he would have reproduced himself in his disciples. So disciples go where the rabbi goes and ultimately, hopefully, become what the rabbi has become. And so for Jesus, who is a rabbi to these disciples, he's saying here, if you want to be with me, this is where I'm going. In other words, he's telling us as much about him as he is about everybody else that's involved. He's saying, I deny myself and I'll be taking up a cross. Now, at that time, they really didn't understand exactly what he meant, so they were probably a little bit confused. But then he goes on, and here's the point that he nails, okay? He says this, he says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel, which literally means for this good news, will save it. This is the principle here. Now, when I first read this, all right, and for a while afterwards, I was like, well, that doesn't seem very nice. You know, it seems like a threat, like, oh, you're with me, or, you know, no good for you. But really, this isn't a threat. He's talking about what we just said. He's saying this is how it is. Like the one who lives trying to save themselves, like assuming that it's all for them, trying to hold on to every opportunity and experience, living completely for me and my own kingdom, like trying to save and earn, gain, like everything for yourself. There will be a time, he's saying, where you'll turn around and feel like it wasn't worth it. Like it's gone. But on the flip side, everything that you have, that you choose to give, and to these people, he's saying to like join me and live for something greater than yourself. That stuff, that's the stuff that's gonna last beyond you. And those are the things you're gonna look back on and feel like it was worth it. Like, ironically, it's paradoxical, right? But he's like, the things you give away, the time, the energy, the investment that you make in other people where you could be doing something else out there, but instead you're like, no, this is for them. Those are the things you're gonna look back on. Even though it feels like a sacrifice in the moment, you're gonna look back on that and be like, that was worth it. That was worth it. And he lets us into the logic here. He says right after that, he says, for what good is it for someone to gain, there's our word, gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? This word for soul here is the same word that he used for life just a minute earlier. He's like, what good is it if you get everything you ever wanted? Like, you have a version of the whole world, okay? Like, there is something in your mind when you think getting everything you ever hoped for and dreamed, right? He's like, what good is it if you get all that and then you look back and feel like it was just a waste? I've shared this with you before, but it's amazing. You should look it up for yourself. It's amazing to see the amount of people that become rich and famous and achieve their dreams, and the rate of like dark depression that comes with that. It is crazy. And the reason is because like you have these people that are working to climb the mountain, like all of us are, to gain the whole world, their version of whatever it looks like. They get up to the top and they're like, there's nothing up here. And then what? That's what he's saying here. He says, or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Like it's priceless. And he's trying to tell people, you will value the things that you give away. It's paradoxical. The things we consume for ourselves, the efforts, the time, the energy, it's just all about me. I'm not saying it's bad to spend things on yourself, But that's the stuff, when you're done, that's done. The stuff that you give away, the time, the energy, the effort you give away, that will live beyond you. That's what will come to mind when people are like, who impacted you? It'll be you. You. So picture this, right? Now, Jesus, he's saying this to disciples, to these people that are going to become his followers. He later would explain, all right, there's going to be a movement. Like, there's going to be more of you that are going to live by my teachings. And this thing, nothing is going to be able to stop it, this movement. What we eventually ended up calling the church, right? And the picture is of all these people together who have adopted this way of thinking. Like, it's not all for me. I'm going to give what I have to something greater. And what we see throughout history is that when the church thinks this way, when it's not just an individual thing, but it's all these individuals doing it together, it has the ability to transform communities, like literally to change the world. In fact, when the church first started, just a little while after Jesus was gone, there are these group of nobodies that have nothing, but they live this way. And all they can leverage is this attitude of love and generosity, like open-handedness, like caring for their community, and they do it. And what's nuts is we have documents from ancient Roman rulers who were running the Roman Empire at that time. And they write in these letters, they're like, these Jesus followers, they treat our people better than we treat our people. Like, what do we do with them? And there were attempts to end this thing, but nothing could stop it. And it just continued to grow rapidly because people wanted to be part of it. There are historians that don't buy into Jesus. Like, they don't believe Jesus is who he said he was. And yet they look back on the church when it first kicked off and they're like, yeah, we can't explain how that nothing movement became something that changed the entire world. Because there's so much power in that, when people come together and start thinking that way. In fact, like we could say that when people like that are thinking that way, that their impact will be measured by what they've given, not by what they've gained. Like, if that's true, then we can also say that the impact of the church, like people that are thinking this way, will be measured by what is given, not by what is gained. By what's given for those on the outside, not what's gained by those on the inside. There's this gravitational pull that every single church has to be consumed with what's going on here. Like the comfort and the whatever programs and whatever else with like what's going on inside these four walls. Just like within every individual, there's this gravitational pull to only care about what's going on in your own life. And when as a church, like this church, if we start to think like that, that will be the end of this church's impact in the community. I heard a story, it was like a metaphor, and honestly, I have no idea where this came from. I don't even know if it's true, it's probably not, but it's such a powerful metaphor, I'll tell it to you. There's this town, it's a coastal town, they live right by the water, and there's this harbor in the town, and apparently it's a dangerous harbor. And right outside the harbor, there's this little island. Often, when ships would come into this harbor, because it was so dangerous, they'd need to call for help. And so the town would send people out to that island, and the people on that little island would help get the ship in safely. So this became such a frequent thing in the town that eventually they stationed people out on that island. And they built them a place, shelter, so that they'd be able to stay out there for a little while. And then they started fixing the place up. They put a carpet in, put in some comfortable seating, a few flat screens. And eventually, the people who were out there got so comfortable and so into their own little meeting place that they stopped going out to help the ships. They forgot the reason they were out there. And that is such a powerful picture of the church. Like what the church can become. There's a guy, his name was William Tyndale. We talked about him a few months ago in that Not For Me series. He said that the church is the only institution that exists for those outside of it. It's why we say here that we are a church for people who don't go to church. We're always thinking about what it's like to not be here, what it's like to not be part of this community, because it's central to what the church was supposed to be. Not a place where we just talk about what we can gain, how we can win, how we can be comfortable right here, but how we can serve and give to those on the outside. Even our parking lot, like what we just did, what we're in the process of doing, it's great. And don't get me wrong, like it'll be nice to not have to, tiptoe around the potholes and make sure one of your kids doesn't, fall into a pit or whatever else is going on in there. But we're doing that ultimately so that it's easier for those on the outside to come in. Because we're an institution that exists for those who live out, for those who are outside of it. It's central to who we are. And so the impact of a church this church will be measured by what's given, not by what's gained. And as soon as we turn inward and become about the insiders, that's when our impact as a church ends. And I'll be honest with you, I know there are a lot of people here, especially in like this season of transition and change. A lot of people who are coming here for the first time are like, is this a good church for me? The real simple question is, do you care about people on the outside? Those people in your life, those people in your family that are like, no, church is not for me. Do you want to be part of a church that is like designed for them? Then I think you'll like it here. But if you're concerned about what's happening about the inside and the comfort of the insiders, this is going to be a tough place for you. Because we want to be known as a church with open hands. For us, the way we put this in like value language, we say that we're here to be the help, not the hero. And so what this looks like for us strategically, this is how we're strategic with our generosity, right? So to give you an example, during COVID, the owner of IHOP in Lindenhurst got connected with Babylon Strong, which is an organization that's serving this community, and decided that he wanted to offer breakfast to the families of essential workers for an entire month, totally for free. And so we heard about that, and we were like, we're here to help. Like, what can we do? And we're not doing breakfast better than IHOP. So we were like, our team was like, we'll deliver. And it doesn't have to be a community church thing, because we're not here to be the hero. We're just here to help. Like, you are already doing it better than we could. How could we get behind what you're doing? During the time that the first stimulus checks went out, we did this thing, we called it Pay It Forward, where certain people that weren't relying on that, I don't know if we were supposed to do this, but they donated their money. And we sent it out to Pronto in Bayshore, which is a food pantry. And they do it. They have systems way better than we could do it. They have systems way better than any systems that we have. So we were like, how can we help? You be the hero. We're just here to help. There was a little girl that decided she wanted to make T-shirts and sell them to raise money during COVID. And so she did. She did it all by herself with her own magic markers, and it ended up being bigger than she thought it was going to be. When it was all done, we went to her house and we matched the money that she raised. We doubled her impact. Not to make it a church thing, but to get behind her, just to be here to help. Every December, we do something called the 12 Days of Christmas. You might have heard it if you've been in the village for a while. It's a long and complicated thing. I'm not going to explain the whole process, but the idea is like during the craziest time of the year, we want to get behind and support the shops in the village, because we want to be here to help. The thing that we are uniquely equipped to do is to offer people the message about Jesus, the hope that Jesus has come to give. And so we do that. For all these other things, we want to get behind people that are already doing it well. We want to be the help, not the hero. And we believe that's how the impact of this church will be measured. In fact, from the start, we sat in a backyard on folding chairs and beach chairs. And we just dreamed about living like this as a church. Just a dozen or so of us. And the question we asked was like, what if this community that this new church is going into, what if they loved that our church was in that community, whether they attended it or not? Whether they believed what we believed or not. And maybe even just doing that would send a powerful message to them. To be a kind of church that just gives. We're just here to help. It's really not about us. Jesus said he came to serve. Jesus, like the guy, said he came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so how much more should we behind him be like, we're just here to serve and to give, to be the help, not the hero. What's kind of cool is that what this means is that the impact of this church could be far greater than one place. But we have to learn to think that way. We have to be concerned about what's happening on the outside. What's also cool is that we are here today because people were already thinking that way. We didn't come up with this. We're not that smart. But there are churches, there's 6 churches all around the country that got together through a group called Orchard Group and decided they wanted to help start a church in Babylon on Long Island. And so 6 different pastors from 6 different churches sit on the board, what we call the management team of this church, and they support us financially. They have been supporting us financially. That support is tapering off because we're getting older now, but they got behind us, and you've probably never heard of them. You know why? Because they were just here to help, not to be the hero. And if you've gotten anything good from this church, it's because of them. And so for us, one of our goals from the start has been to be a sending church through that group called Orchard Group. To connect with another person who wants to start a church and to join with other churches and help get behind them. And what's exciting is that we're finally there. This is Jesse and Becca Lusko. They just last week, they kicked off their first church service in Portland, Oregon. And so the impact, what you're doing here is already extending to other places around the country. You'll hear from them, they'll be here, they'll introduce themselves, but right now they just kicked off. They're doing their second service ever right now. So I was like, you stay there and don't worry about us, we'll be fine, I'll show you a picture. But we're here to help. We're here to help. And so for us, just so you know, logistically, whenever we talk about stuff like this, one of the concerns, honestly, one of the fears of mine is that people think we're just rolling in the dough and just have money to Scrooge McDuck, But it's not that way. There's not a surplus of cash. From the start, literally from day one, we have budgeted to give away 10% of the money that we have. It's the first money to be set aside to be given. And finally, we have enough to not just do things in the community here, but to get behind another church. And so that's how that works. My question for you, think about this. Really, what would it look like if people in this community loved that this church was here? Whether they believe what we believe or not. Whether they attend this church or not. What would it take? According to Jesus, I think it would take us being more concerned about what's going on out there than in here. caring more about connecting with people out there than comforting people in here. And at the end of the day, I think that's what will determine whether or not this church makes an impact in the community. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here, but then we'll wrap up. Here's what I think is a pretty good picture of this. There are two people on our team. I'm not going to tell you what their name is because I haven't asked their permission to tell this story. But if you've been around, you probably can connect the dots. One of them is a host, and another one works out in the parking lot. They've been on our team now for a few years. And if you talk to them, they just gush over this church. Like, this church has it's done so much for us. It's given so much for us. We love it so much. And they serve in just about every area you can possibly serve. Like, in our meetings, we're like, no, we can't ask them to do anything else. They're already doing too much. They give so much. And yet when I talk to them, they're like, this church has done so much for us. And what's amazing is that I'm listening to them thinking there's no way we could possibly do for you the amount that you've done for us. But that's the exact point that Jesus is making. You see, like, it is in what you give and in how you serve. It's in those things that it will feel more than anything else that you have received. That's where the value is. And so this church, make no mistake, if you've come to see this church as a church of impact, it's because people like that have given so much. Their time, their energy, their resources. And it's people like that ultimately will determine whether or not this church becomes known for its impact. Whether or not we become a church that's concerned about what's inside, what we can gain, or a church that is here with open hands to give.